Is the economy recovering from the recession? How can we say for sure? And what does that mean for you? Answers next on Evening Exchange. Hi, I'm Kojo Nnamdi. Trying to get economists to agree is a little bit like herding cats, not easy. So the fact that they all seem to agree that we have had a mortgage meltdown which triggered a credit crisis and a severe recession should mean something to us. But what would be more meaningful today is if we can get a grip on where the nation is now, whether we are in fact emerging from the recession, whether it would mean a jobless recovery. What that means, how it would be a recovery if we can't reduce unemployment. And is the mortgage crisis still at the center of the downturn? In our continuing series, Facing the Mortgage Crisis, we look ahead. Here to tell us where we're likely to be going from here is Margaret Sims, Senior Fellow with the Urban Institute, and Dr. Rodney Green, Executive Director of Howard University's Center for Urban Progress and the Chair of Howard University's Department of Economics. Dr. Green, allow me to start with you. Are we, in fact, showing signs of a recovery from the recession?
I would say that the signs of recovery have been very minimal and maybe very short-lived. I think that we are most likely facing a kind of double-dip recession where there will be some small improvements, but the weight of the economic challenges that are facing us will probably lead us back down into a continuing recession, perhaps even deeper than we're in right now.
Margaret Sims, is it correct to say, as many have been saying, that this is the worst recession that we have had since the Great Depression, but it is, however, not a depression?
Well, it's certainly not a depression. As to whether it's the worst since the Great Depression, I think we're out neck and neck right now with the early 80s, but we may easily surpass it if we get to more than 10% unemployment, for example.
Before we get into the specifics of it, Dr. Green, it has been said that if we are in a recovery, we are in the early stages of that recovery, and that, like the last two recessions, the early stages are likely to be characterized by continued joblessness, that it is going to be a jobless recovery. Can you explain that, please?
Well, certainly. The problem with the recovery is that initially businesses try to increase their output without increasing labor. In other words, they're still trying to cut costs because many of them have been very challenged by the drop in profits that they've faced, the falling markets that they've been dealing with, and so therefore they're very reluctant to bring on new workers. So this is typical of most recessions. I think it may be particularly serious in this one. We've seen the unemployment rate reach very high levels and will probably continue to grow substantially over the next 2 years.
Margaret Sims, we've often heard the phrase, when America catches a cold, minority communities catch pneumonia, implying that when America is in a recession, what in effect is happening in minority communities is a depression. Is it that much worse in minority communities than it is in the rest of the nation?
Well, some might argue,
especially in urban areas.
Well, some might argue that for many African American communities, they are always in depression, that there are few jobs available in the community, and people survive through a variety of public supports, maybe some informal work. But certainly if you look at the broad picture of African American workforce, that yes, you see much more severe effects of the unemployment on them, so that unemployment rates typically are twice as high in the African American community as they are in the white community, and that's certainly the case in this recession.
Well, Dr. Green, when the stimuli started in the George W. Bush administration and continued into the Obama administration, our understanding was that following the mortgage crisis, we had a debt crisis, that debt was drying up, and the initial stimulus package was intended to help, well, investment banks and others, because it was felt that crucial to the recovery would be the restoration of the availability of credit. Is that beginning to happen yet?
Thus far, credit has still been very, very tight. especially in commercial real estate. There's almost no credit being offered, especially for the various instruments that have been developed to help support that industry. So I would say that the banks and the financial institutions have been particularly slow in recovering their approach to the credit market. And that's been a kind of big indictment of the emphasis that a lot of the federal programs have made on helping out the banks. Where is the follow-through? Where is it coming out to the rest of the community?
The logic there was that if in fact the banks are assisted, if the banks can return to profitability, then that would logically result in the expansion of credit. But it seems that the logic is not working out at this point. Are we talking here about a subjective decision that banks have to make in order to expand credit? And if they're not making that, what would be the reason why they're not?
Well, they seem to have used a lot of the stimulus money to do things that they think is things that are in the interest of their shareholders. So they have acquired other banks, for example, with some of the stimulus money. They have used it to purchase other kinds of assets. The idea of making loans in a period where the risk seems to be high to them is not on their agenda, even if it is on the agenda of the government and of course, the mass of consumers in the society.
Margaret Sims, people who have been critical of the stimulus packages have said, why are you helping Wall Street rather than helping Main Street? The logic of helping Wall Street, as I said earlier, had to do with the possibility, the likelihood maybe, of expanding credit. What is your understanding of what helping Main Street would be like?
Well, certainly to some extent you do have to have a stable financial system in order to make a lot of progress. But in order to help mainstream, we need to focus on two kinds of things. There are short-term issues that we need to deal with, that is people who don't have jobs and who need to get jobs. We have an unemployment compensation system that is geared toward people who have records of steady employment for periods of time with employers who've been paying into the unemployment system. There are a lot of people who are unemployed who are not eligible or who are not eligible for extended periods of time. There have been some extensions on unemployment benefits, but they don't necessarily trickle down to people who would not otherwise be eligible. So there's some issues that we need to deal with there. We need to deal with boosting the employment services side of the unemployment system. They're not just supposed to be giving you a check, they're supposed to be helping you find a job. Now, the jobs of tomorrow or the jobs of next year may not be the jobs of last year. And certainly the Obama administration has tried to address this in putting money into training for green jobs. We don't really know what those green jobs are going to be in all cases. But some of them, for example, are in weatherization, in public housing, and they're supposed to be targeted to people who live in those communities. But I don't think there's been enough coordination looking at how to get people prepared for those jobs and get them into those jobs, and to get young people thinking more about what the jobs of the future are going to be like and how you train and prepare yourself for those jobs. Those are going to be some things we really need to start dealing with.
Dr. Green, there are a couple of aspects of this I want to look at. A number of conservatives felt that the best way to get money back into the economy is, needless to say, tax cuts. They argue that tax cuts lead to the creation of jobs more than any other single phenomenon, and they figured that if those tax cuts could be extended to people who are of middle income, then those people would be spending more. That has been, for the last several decades, their ongoing formula for stimulating the economy. The Obama administration chose not to go that way. Would, in fact, in an economy like this, tax cuts contribute to the creation of jobs?
I would say that it's very indirect and a lot more minimal than is usually argued for. You may recall back in the days of the Reagan administration, there was this concept called the Laffer curve, which was that if you just cut taxes enough, it would create so much exciting entrepreneurial developments that you would have more money coming into the government even though you cut the rate of taxes. That's proven not to be true at all, and therefore we don't find that kind of high-level stimulus coming from tax cuts. We're more likely to find the stimulus to the economy coming from direct government expenditures or payments to people, as Margaret talked about, who are in a situation where they are running out of unemployment benefits and they need money simply to spend to survive.
When we talk about government contributing to or providing unemployment, what the president indicated is that there's a great deal of infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt throughout America, and that if stimulus dollars could go to the rebuilding of that infrastructure, then they would create jobs. But in a lot of cases, that's left up to the states to decide what to do with that money. Are we seeing any results yet that the rebuilding of infrastructure is leading to the creation of jobs in any significant way?
There have been significant amounts of job creation in road building and bridge construction, although it's slow in coming on stream because some of those projects were, as they call it, shovel ready, but many of them the shovel was a little while in coming. So I think that there has been some improvement there, and that is a classic way of trying to increase employment in a period like the one we're in. So I think that that's a useful approach if you're trying to offset the immediate unemployment situation. Plus, the infrastructure is in terrible shape. The bridges are collapsing, roads are falling apart. I mean, we have a tremendous amount of work to do there. I would say, though, that in many cases, some of these shovel-ready projects may actually contribute to some negative things, which is when you build roads, you're not building bike paths. When you're building bridges for trucks to go, you're not really trying to come up with a more green economy. So a lot of there's some contradictions in some of these programs. But in terms of strict employment, I would say that the building of roads and bridges is definitely very helpful.
I'm going to get to the green economy in a second, Margaret Sims, but following up on the point that Rodney Green was making here, there are those who say that, yes, you can rebuild infrastructure, but those jobs are not sustainable. After that's done, those jobs go away again.
Well, I think there are two things I want to say on that point. One is that it is the case that those specific jobs go away. But if you would assume that the economy takes off, there would be private sector jobs that require similar skills that people might be put to work in. But for the African American community, one of the things we need to think about is that there are a lot of women heading families who don't do construction work. Not in every case that they can't, but it's not an industry in which women are very well represented or very well treated. So when we think about how to use stimulus to expand employment, we also need to be considerate of who is unemployed and who is it that's supporting families. It's true that non-custodial parents ought to be included as we think about these things, but we certainly need to think about women too, because often it takes two adults in a family to make it possible to get ahead.
Your suggestion, or certainly my inference from your suggestion, is that we are not focusing on women at all, especially at a time when in the African American community there are so many female-headed households that the stimulus packages that we have seen, it is my inference that in your view have not been targeted in that way at all at women.
Not in terms of the sort of thinking about how to engage them in employment. There are some, there was some money to expand TANF on an emergency basis where it could be used for public jobs, which would have been available for women. We don't know yet how many states are taking up that option.
And TANF is our tenant assistance program.
Temporary assistance to needy families.
Needy families, correct.
The new welfare program.
Dr. Green, talk a little bit about the green economy, because what we have been hearing is that in recession, in a way, there is opportunity, and that is we can now try to rebuild our society in a more green way, that we can try to become more sustainable, that we can build in a way that we can cut down on greenhouse gases, but on the emission of greenhouse gases. But you just made the point that building roads and providing, I guess, cash for clunkers does not do a great deal, even though the argument has to be made that in cash for clunkers, that if you trade in your car for one that emits less greenhouse gases, then that's how you get a better deal, and therefore it's in a way contributing. But it seems to me, and it seems to a lot of critics, that we should be trying to use the same kind of innovation, initiative, and direction of dollars towards trying to build rail and public transportation, and that's what we don't seem to be doing at this point.
I think that's correct, that we haven't moved in a green direction very much at all. And part of the reason for that, I think, has to do with the tremendous political weight of many of the energy companies who really like the way it's working now. In other words, they make a lot of money off of the use of roads, gasoline and so on. So it's not surprising that there's been a very, very slow move towards any kind of greening of the economy. The efforts to do that, of course, are positive, and if we could have more of that, that would certainly begin to help the global warming problem. But I think that the global warming problem is far more severe than any of the kind of green economy proposals that have been put forward are. I mean, we're facing really all kinds of serious problems over the next few decades with rising sea levels and all the other things that go with global warming that are going to take a much more concerted effort than the current green economy plans.
Margaret Sims, let's look at the cities for a second here, because what we have been witnessing in the country is the exportation of manufacturing jobs that are causing cities like Detroit and Pittsburgh to practically fall apart. And there are those people who say that, look, if manufacturing jobs are being exported, if we are no longer a fundamentally manufacturing economy, if we are this information economy and we have to find a new niche for the creation of jobs, then what better place to do that than in cities? What better place to try out whether or not the green economy can be the economic engine that drives American and a global future is in the cities of the United States. That's where we should start. That's where we should see our money going.
Well, certainly we should not exclude metro areas, especially those in need, from the idea of a green economy and how to contribute to a green economy. But I think we need to be very thoughtful about diversification. You know, one of the reasons that Michigan is having problems is it was heavy into automobiles, and when the automobile industry moved elsewhere for a variety of reasons, then it left the economy devastated. To get on just one bandwagon that goes by again is not going to be in the best interest in the long term. I think that the city and the state need to think about a variety of industries in which they could be competitive. Some of it may be green jobs. They're already targeting the health industries in terms of healthcare, in terms of a number of other aspects. But it's going to require a lot of thought about what is the short term and what is the long term, because we don't want to tell people who are currently unemployed that, okay, in 5 years we'll have this new economy when you can get a job, because they need to feed their family, they need to have shelter for their families right now. So we need to have a multi-pronged strategy to look to how to make for economic security.
And of course, if we're looking at 10% rates of unemployment, there are two aspects of that I'd like to raise. First, Rodney Green, it is said that when we might see an expansion in the job market is with the return of consumer confidence. And of course, trying to predict the return of consumer confidence, I guess, has sent a lot of economists into another field of employment completely. But how does one gauge whether or not we are likely to see a return of consumer confidence? Clearly right now people are scared. Clearly right now people cannot get the kind of credit that had us spending during the go-go years of the past decade or so. So what is it that can inspire consumer confidence, and what are the early indications that it's coming back?
Consumer confidence depends a lot on consumer income. If people are losing their jobs, if they're facing a situation where they're having to take many furlough days a year so that they have an effective cut in their salary and wages, if they're facing these kinds of situations, their confidence will not return. They have to see in their own household some improvement in the cash flow. Now, if they see it happening elsewhere, it might encourage them to think that there's a good future for them and to start spending. But the reality is it's very difficult to borrow anything right now. People are scared because of the crunch that's hit them. Many people have gone into bankruptcy or come close, had to sell off their assets, empty out their 401ks and so on just to survive. So I don't think consumer confidence is coming back anytime soon. And as I said earlier, I think we're actually more likely facing a more deeper recession in the coming years.
Why do you say that?
Well, because the market for the goods that have been produced and will be produced simply isn't there on a global basis. In past recessions, there have been engines for growth on a global basis. Usually it's been the United States with its high debt level of borrowing money and buying things as a nation from the rest of the world, and has pulled other parts of the world out of recession. But today, every country in the world is in a recession, and there is no obvious place for an engine to pull us out. So I think more likely is we're facing more of a continued recession, which could deepen in the coming period of time.
Margaret Sims, about 20 years ago, I was hearing the phrase permanent underclass a great deal. Now we're looking at an increase in unemployment for people who for the past 2 decades have in general been employed. I don't hear the term permanent underclass anymore, and I certainly don't hear any policies that are directed at making that permanent underclass a temporary underclass. Is it A, that we no longer have a permanent underclass, or B, we no longer subscribe to that concept, or C, has this permanent underclass essentially been forgotten?
Well, I think the term of the day is disconnected. That is people who are disconnected from work and disconnected from school, and in many cases also disconnected from public supports. Well, we don't really know how many of these people are surviving. Some of them are doing it through informal work. That is, they may do gardening or entertainment or day jobs on construction work, for which they probably don't pay taxes. And because it may be a cash transaction, there's no paper trail to really catch them in the system, so to speak. We're beginning to look a little at how you might encourage some of those people, at least on the margins, those who are in informal work sector, into the formal sector. How can you make it more attractive for them to be self-employed and to go through some more formal processes? So one of the things that, for example, is a problem for people who are in self-employment is that you pay both halves of the Social Security tax rather than having it shared with an employer. And that could be a very steep price for people whose incomes are modest. So being informally employed is a lot better from that standpoint. But it not only keeps you disconnected, it means that you're not building up Social Security credits for retirement. I think we have to, again, think about multiple strategies to pull people into the economy. Some of it is going to be about training. People are not ready to take jobs. Some of it is about support for people who have mental health problems, who have substance abuse problems. Our services there are very low compared to the need for those. It's going to be about how to get people connected to the job markets when they live in one community and the jobs are in another.
And Rodney Green, we have been hearing the use of the phrase teachable moment in a completely different context, but it seems to me that this is a particularly teachable moment for students and scholars of economics in the United States and around the world. If it is in fact a teachable moment, what are we learning here about capitalism? What are we learning here about the free market system? What are we learning about regulation and deregulation of the free market system?
Well, I think that the economics profession since the early 70s has got locked into kind of an old way of looking at the economy that would always grow. It would have the free market would work perfectly, and that they called it rational expectations, and there's a number of other terms that they had for that. And as a result, most of our students from the 70s forward learned essentially an old classical way of thinking about the economy, really almost an Adam Smith way of thinking about the economy, with a lot more math. And I think that what we've learned from this moment, which is clearly a teachable moment, last year, my class in Principles of Economics, we spent more time talking about financial structures and what it meant and how could this happen and all that sort of thing than we did talking about supply and demand. So I would say, though, that the kind of teaching that we're coming up on now is the limitations of a market system. That is, a lack of regulation in a market system can easily lead to the spinning off all kinds of distress in the community, that it's not an automatically stable economy. And so that the questions are being raised now by students and other teachers about whether the standard capitalist model is actually the best for everyone. These issues used to be discussed a lot more back in the early part of the 20th century and so on. But now people are raising questions about things like socialism, about regulation of markets, about bringing back some of the regulation that came after the last depression. Maybe we should reinstitute some of those things. So there's a whole range of interesting and exciting discussions. People are now talking about Adam Smith versus Karl Marx, for example. Karl Marx has been in, kind of a marginal force for a long time, but now people are talking about him seriously, just in the same way they talk about Adam Smith. So it's a really exciting time in the academy. I just wish we didn't have to do it on the backs of all these poor people that are being devastated by the current recession.
Margaret Sims, we thought the result of the last election was a very exciting time for our democracy because it said a great deal about how we have, in a way, expanded our horizons. What I'm not sure we expected is that it would be dominated by an economic crisis in this way. Does that also mean that it is still a very exciting time?
I think it's a very exciting time. As my colleagues and I say at the Urban Institute, it's a time of great opportunity because when there is a crisis, as there was in the Great Depression, there was great opportunity for public policy and for ways of shoring up economic security for families.
And I'm afraid that's about just all the time we have. You mentioned Karl Marx. It was Mao Zedong who said, "Let us take war and make revolution." I guess now we can say, let us take economic recession and create a new economy. Thank you all for joining us. You can find more information on these organizations and how to face the mortgage crisis on our website at whut.org. As always, stay well. Good night.